Stalingrad, late November 1942. The temperature has dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, and the city that once housed 500,000 people is now a landscape of gutted apartment blocks, collapsed factory floors, and rubble so thick that soldiers navigate by memorizing the skeletons of buildings rather than streets. Somewhere within the ruins of the Red October steel plant, a young Soviet marksman named Vasily Zaitsev lies motionless beneath a sheet of corrugated metal, his breath held so long his lungs ache, watching a gap between two collapsed walls no wider than a car door. He has been in this position, according to the story that would later make him famous, for nearly 9 hours. Somewhere out there, hidden with equal patience, is a German sniper the Soviets believe has been sent from Berlin specifically to kill him. For 3 days, the two men are said to have hunted one another through a maze of shattered concrete and frozen corpses, each waiting for the other to blink first. It is one of the most celebrated sniper duels ever told, endlessly reproduced in books, propaganda posters, and a Hollywood film that cemented it in popular memory. And yet, as with so much that emerged from the fog of Stalingrad, the closer historians look at this duel, the more it begins to dissolve into legend. This is the story of that duel, the man at its center, and the uncomfortable question of how much of it might never have happened at all. By the autumn of 1942, the fighting inside Stalingrad had degenerated into something closer to siege warfare than any battle either side had trained for. The German Sixth Army, having smashed through the Soviet steppe with the speed that had characterized their advances since 1939, found its momentum swallowed by a city that refused to fall in a conventional sense. Tanks proved almost useless in streets choked with debris. Artillery barrages that would have leveled resistance elsewhere simply created more cover, more rubble, more places for a man with a rifle to vanish into. Soviet defenders, pinned against the western bank of the Volga with their backs to the river, adopted a doctrine that traded ground for time, holding buildings floor by floor, sometimes room by room. Losses on both sides climbed into figures that strain belief even now. Some estimates place total casualties from the Battle of Stalingrad across its full 5 months at close to 2 million dead, wounded, or captured. Within this grinding, dehumanizing context, the Soviet High Command recognized something the Germans had already exploited earlier in the war. A handful of well-trained marksmen could inflict damage wildly disproportionate to their numbers, and just as importantly, could terrify an enemy in ways that artillery never could. A soldier can steel himself against a barrage he can hear coming. He cannot steel himself against the idea that an invisible man half a kilometer away might already have him in his sights. The Soviets needed men who could exploit that fear, and they needed a story to go with them. Conventional Red Army propaganda in 1942 was struggling. Early defeats, staggering losses, and the collapse of entire fronts had left morale fragile, and Stalin's regime understood, perhaps better than any other government of the era, that war is fought as much in the imagination of soldiers as on the ground beneath their feet. What the Soviets required was not merely marksmanship, they required a hero. Vasily Zaitsev was, by most accounts that survive, a genuinely gifted shot. Born in 1915 in the Ural Mountains to a family of hunters, he had grown up stalking wolves and elk through forests where a wasted bullet meant a hungry winter. And by his own later recollections, he had killed his first wolf with his grandfather's rifle at the age of 12. When he arrived in Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942 as a naval infantryman, he was already in his late 20s, older and steadier than many of the conscripts around him. According to Soviet military records and to Zaitsev's own memoir published years after the war, he was credited with 225 kills during the battle, a figure that Soviet propaganda seized upon almost immediately. He was given proper sniper training, a Mosin Nagant rifle fitted with a Pu telescopic sight, An optic capable of roughly 3.5 times magnification, about what a decent pair of household binoculars might offer, but sufficient at the ranges involved in urban fighting, often 200 to 400 meters, to pick out a helmet rim or a shoulder through a gap in brickwork. The rifle itself weighed around 4 kilograms unloaded, a modest, unglamorous weapon compared to the engineering marvels being built elsewhere in the war. Yet, in the right hands, it became one of the most feared instruments on the Eastern Front. Zaitsev did not merely shoot, he taught. He is credited with training a school of snipers within the Soviet 62nd Army. Men and women who fanned out through the ruins in pairs, one spotting through binoculars while the other held the rifle, patient as ice, for hours at a stretch. It was this school and Zaitsev's growing reputation within it that the Soviet propaganda apparatus began to publicize through the army newspaper, transforming an effective marksman into a symbol of Soviet resilience against the German war machine. It is here, in the gap between effective marksman and national symbol, that the famous duel enters the story and where the historical record becomes genuinely difficult to pin down. According to the version popularized after the war, chiefly through Soviet accounts, and later through William Craig's 1973 book Enemy at the Gates, the German High Command, frustrated by the losses their men were suffering to Soviet snipers, dispatched the head of their own sniper school, a colonel or major identified in various tellings as Erwin König or Heinz Thorwald, to Stalingrad with the specific mission of hunting down and killing Zaitsev. What followed, in this telling, was a multi-day cat-and-mouse contest fought across the ruins near the Red October and Barricade factories, in which each sniper attempted to draw the other into revealing his position using decoys, feints, and near-supernatural patience. In the most dramatic version of events, Zaitsev is said to have finally exposed his rival by using a comrade to raise a helmet on a stick, drawing a shot, then using the glint of afternoon sun off a discarded pane of glass to spot the German's scope, and killing him with a single round through the optic itself. It is a magnificent story. It is also a story that no German military record has ever confirmed. No sniper school commander named König or Thorwald appears in surviving Wehrmacht personnel records for the relevant period, and no German unit history from the Stalingrad campaign mentions the dispatch of a master marksman to eliminate a specific Soviet counterpart. Zaitsev's own diary entries and early interviews, the versions closest in time to the actual events, are notably vaguer than the polished legend that emerged later, describing an unnamed enemy sniper rather than a named master hunter sent by Berlin. Historians such as Antony Beevor, whose research into Stalingrad drew on Soviet and German archives alike, have suggested that the duel, if it involved a specific extended contest with a specific named opponent at all, was substantially embellished in the retelling, likely conflating several genuine engagements with enemy marksmen into a single, cleaner narrative that served the propaganda needs of the moment far better than the messier truth. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of Stalingrad's strange, brutal history still to come. None of this is to say that sniper duels did not happen at Stalingrad, or that Zaitsev did not kill Germans with genuine skill under horrific conditions. Soviet after-action reports from the 62nd Army do reference specific engagements between named Soviet snipers and unidentified enemy marksmen, and the broader phenomenon of sniper warfare in the ruined city is corroborated from both sides, including in the memoirs of German soldiers who described a paralyzing fear of movement in daylight. What the evidence does not support is the specific cinematic 3-day duel against a named German master sniper exactly as later popularized. This pattern, incidentally, mirrors something the Germans themselves had already been doing on other fronts. German snipers, particularly those trained at the Wehrmacht's dedicated sniper schools, such as the one at Wunsdorf, had built their own mythology around figures whose kill counts, while often real, were amplified for domestic consumption. The comparison is instructive. Both totalitarian war machines, Soviet and German alike, understood by 1942 that the individual marksman made for better propaganda than the impersonal machinery of artillery and armor, and both were willing to shape the historical record to suit that need. American and British forces, fighting a very different kind of war in North Africa and later Western Europe, employed snipers with less of this mythologizing apparatus behind them, in part because the static, house-to-house nature of Eastern Front combat rewarded this kind of storytelling in ways that the more mobile Western campaigns did not. British snipers of the period, trained through programs that would later influence post-war doctrine, tended to be discussed in far more clinical, unit-level terms, rather than as singular folk heroes, a genuinely notable difference in how the same skill was presented to the public depending on which government was doing the presenting. The impact of the Zaitsev legend, whatever its factual foundation, was real and arguably more significant than the individual kills themselves. Fear is a genuine military resource, and the belief among German soldiers that Soviet snipers might be watching any exposed doorway or window measurably slowed movement through contested areas, forcing men to take longer, more cautious routes, and to expend more effort on cover, effort that could not then be spent elsewhere. Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, drew tangible morale from the idea that one of their own had bested a supposed German master hunter sent specifically to destroy him, a narrative of the underdog turning the tables that mapped neatly onto the broader Soviet self-image of the war. Zaitsev survived Stalingrad, though he was wounded and partially blinded by a mortar blast in early 1943, underwent surgery to restore his sight, and lived until 1991, long enough to see his story become a cultural touchstone rather than simply a wartime record. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor, and his rifle is preserved today in the Stalingrad Battle Panorama Museum in Volgograd, the city that was Stalingrad renamed, where visitors can still see the modest wooden stock and the small telescopic sight that, embellished or not, became one of the war's most enduring symbols. The 2001 film Enemy at the Gates, starring Jude Law as Zaitsev, took the already dramatized post-war legend and dramatized it further still, adding a fictional love interest and compressing the timeline for cinematic effect, ensuring that several more generations would absorb the duel as essentially factual when the honest answer is that historians remain divided between probably a real but exaggerated encounter and largely a propaganda construction built around a genuinely skilled marksman. What then do we actually know for certain, stripped of Cold War myth-making and Hollywood embellishment? We know that Vasily Zaitsev was a real man, a real hunter-turned-soldier, who by all credible accounts killed a substantial number of German soldiers during the Battle of Stalingrad using genuine skill honed since childhood. We know that sniper warfare was a documented, significant feature of the fighting in that city, shaping tactics and terrifying soldiers on both sides in ways that conventional accounts of tank battles and artillery duels often overlook. We know that the specific 3-day duel against a named German master sniper, as it has been told and retold for 80 years, rests on shakier evidential ground than its fame suggests. Likely the product of Soviet wartime propaganda needs meeting a natural human hunger for a clean, satisfying story amid the chaos of one of history's bloodiest urban battles. And we know, perhaps most importantly, that this tension between the story we want and the story the evidence supports is not a flaw unique to Stalingrad. It runs through the history of nearly every war, in every century, wherever a single individual's actions become too useful a symbol for propagandists, filmmakers, or simply grieving nations to leave alone. Return for a moment to that gap in the rubble, the sheet of corrugated metal, the held breath in -20 degrees. Whether or not a specific German colonel truly lay in wait on the other side of that ruined factory floor, the fear was real. The cold was real. the 2 million dead of Stalingrad were entirely unbearably real. What has softened over 80 years is not the horror of the battle, but the shape of one particular story extracted from it, sanded down and polished by propagandists, novelists, and filmmakers, until the rough edges of uncertain records disappeared beneath a narrative too satisfying to interrogate. Vasily Zaitsev killed men in that city, whether he killed one specific man in one specific duel exactly as the legend insists remains and will likely always remain unresolved. That is not a failure of the story. It is the story, or at least the truest version available to us. A reminder that history's most famous moments are rarely footnotes we can trust at face value, and that the duel worth studying is not always the one between two riflemen in the snow, but the one between memory and evidence that continues quietly long after the guns have fallen silent.